In 1944, 98-year-old veteran Harold Murphy fought in the D-Day landings, but while receiving treatment in the hospital, he began exhibiting strange behaviors. Nurse Sarah noticed the elderly man watching outside through the window at night and muttering German words, but when she examined Harold's file, the truth she discovered shocked everyone. Sarah Mitchell had been working as a night nurse at Riverside Veterans Medical Center for 12 years, and she thought she had seen everything. At 34, she had developed an intuitive understanding of her elderly patients, their needs, their fears, and their quirks. Veterans, especially those from World War II, often carried invisible wounds that manifested in unexpected ways, but Harold Murphy was different from any patient she had ever encountered. Harold had been admitted to the long-term care wing 3 weeks earlier, suffering from pneumonia and general deterioration that often accompanies advanced age. At 98, he was one of the oldest D-Day survivors still alive, a fact that the hospital staff treated with appropriate reverence. His medical chart listed him as Harold Murphy, born in Boston, Massachusetts, served with the 29th Infantry Division during the Normandy invasion on June 6, 1944. But from his first night in the hospital, Harold's behavior had been peculiar. It started with the sleeplessness. While most elderly patients dozed frequently throughout the day and night, Harold remained alert during the dark hours, sitting upright in his bed with an intensity that seemed inappropriate for his age and condition. His pale blue eyes, still sharp despite his advanced years, would fix on the window that faced the hospital's parking lot and the wooded area beyond. Sarah first noticed his unusual behavior during her second week caring for him. She was making her routine 2 a.m. medication rounds when she observed Harold sitting perfectly still, staring out the window with an expression of deep concentration. His lips were moving silently, as if he were having a conversation with someone only he could see. "Mr. Murphy," Sarah had whispered, not wanting to startle him, "are you having trouble sleeping? I can get you something to help." Harold had turned to her with a look of surprise, as if he had forgotten where he was. "Oh, Sarah," he said, his voice carrying a slight accent that she couldn't quite place. "I was just watching. Old habits, you know." "Watching for what?" she asked gently. Harold's expression had darkened. "For them," he said simply, then lay back down and pretended to sleep. As the nights passed, Sarah began to pay closer attention to Harold's nocturnal activities. She discovered that his watching followed a specific pattern. Every night between 1:30 and 4 a.m., he would position himself at the window and maintain a vigilant surveillance of the grounds below. His body language suggested he was on guard duty, scanning for threats that only he could perceive. But what truly disturbed Sarah was what she began to hear during these watching sessions. Harold would mutter under his breath in what sounded like German. Sarah had taken German in high school and recognized some of the words and phrases, though his pronunciation was too soft and his accent too thick for her to understand everything he was saying. What she could make out included words like wachen, to watch, Gefahr, danger, and sie kommen, they're coming. This was deeply troubling for several reasons. First, Harold was supposed to be an American veteran who had fought against the Germans. Second, his pronunciation and fluency suggested more than just casual familiarity with the language. Third, the content of his German mutterings seemed to indicate he was expecting some kind of attack or intrusion. Sarah tried to convince herself that Harold's behavior could be explained by post-traumatic stress disorder or dementia-related confusion. Many veterans experienced flashbacks or episodes where they believed they were back in combat situations. Perhaps Harold was reliving memories of being on guard duty during the war, and the German words were fragments of enemy communications he had overheard decades ago. But her rationalization became harder to maintain as Harold's behavior grew more specific and purposeful. One night, Sarah observed him arranging items on his bedside table in a particular pattern. His water glass, medication bottles, and personal belongings positioned at precise angles and distances. When she asked him about it, Harold claimed he was just organizing his things, but the arrangement looked suspiciously like a code or signal system. Another night, she caught him writing in a small notebook he kept hidden under his mattress. When she approached to check on him, he quickly closed the notebook and slipped it back into its hiding place. In the brief moment she glimpsed the page, she could see what appeared to be numbers and letters arranged in columns, possibly some kind of cipher or coded message. Most disturbing of all was the night she heard him speaking German in full sentences, conducting what sounded like a one-sided conversation with someone he was watching for outside the window. His tone was respectful but urgent, as if he were reporting to a superior officer. The fluency and natural flow of his German speech suggested it was not a language he had learned casually or recently. Sarah's concern reached a breaking point when she realized that Harold's watching schedule coincided with the shift changes of the hospital's security staff. He seemed to know exactly when the guards would be making their rounds and when the parking lot would be most vulnerable to observation. This level of awareness suggested he was conducting actual surveillance rather than simply experiencing confused memories. Unable to ignore her growing suspicions any longer, Sarah decided to investigate Harold's background more thoroughly. She had access to his basic medical records, but she wanted to understand more about his military service and personal history. Something about his story didn't add up, and she felt a responsibility to uncover the truth, both for her own peace of mind and for the safety of the other patients and staff. Sarah began her investigation by examining Harold's medical file more carefully. His admission paperwork listed his next of kin as a nephew named Robert Murphy, who lived in California. According to the records, Harold had no other surviving family members and had been living alone in a small apartment in Boston before his hospitalization. His military service record, as provided to the hospital, was remarkably sparse for someone who claimed to have participated in D-Day. The documentation showed he had served with the 29th Infantry Division from 1943 to 1945, participating in the Normandy invasion and subsequent European campaign. He had been discharged with the rank of Private First Class and had received standard service medals, but no special commendations or awards. What struck Sarah as odd was the lack of detail in the record. Most D-Day veterans she had encountered took great pride in their service and could recite specific details about their units, their commanders, and their experience. Harold, by contrast, rarely spoke about his military service and seemed uncomfortable when staff members thanked him for his sacrifice. Sarah decided to do some independent research on Harold's supposed military unit. She spent her off-duty hours at the local library and online, looking up information about the 29th Infantry Division and their role in the D-Day invasion. What she learned made her even more suspicious about Harold's story. The 29th Infantry Division had indeed participated in D-Day, landing at Omaha Beach in one of the most heavily contested and bloody assaults of the entire operation. The division had suffered enormous casualties, with some companies losing more than 90% of their men in the first hours of the landing. The survivors of this unit were considered among the most heroic soldiers of the entire war. However, when Sarah cross-referenced Harold's personal details with the available military records, she found inconsistencies. The 29th Infantry Division's roster from 1944 did not include anyone named Harold Murphy with his birth date and place of origin. Moreover, the Social Security number listed in his medical file had been issued in 1947, 3 years after D-Day, which seemed unusual for someone born in 1925. These discrepancies prompted Sarah to dig deeper into Harold's background. She contacted the Department of Veterans Affairs to verify his service record, claiming she needed the information for his medical treatment. The response she received was startling. There was no record of a Harold Murphy with his biographical details having served in the U.S. military during World War II. This revelation forced Sarah to confront the possibility that Harold Murphy was not who he claimed to be. If he wasn't an American veteran, then who was he? And why was he in a veterans hospital under false pretenses? Sarah's investigation took a dramatic turn when she decided to research German military records from World War II. Using Harold's approximate age and physical characteristics, she searched through databases of German personnel who might have served during the war. The process was complicated by the fact that many German military records had been destroyed during the war or lost in the chaos that followed Germany's defeat. However, Sarah's persistence paid off when she discovered a reference to a Heinrich Müller who had served in the German Wehrmacht during World War II. The physical description and age matched Harold's profile, and most significantly, Heinrich Müller had been reported as missing in action during the final months of the war when German forces were retreating across Europe. Further research revealed that Heinrich Müller had been a member of a German intelligence unit that specialized in interrogation and counterintelligence operations. His unit had been responsible for identifying and capturing Allied spies and resistance fighters behind German lines. According to the fragmentary records available, Müller had been fluent in English and had been used to interrogate captured American and British soldiers. This discovery explained Harold's fluency in German and his apparent familiarity with surveillance techniques. But it raised even more disturbing questions about how a German intelligence operative had ended up in an American veterans hospital under a false identity. Sarah's investigation revealed that Heinrich Müller had disappeared during the chaotic final weeks of World War II, when German forces were collapsing on all fronts. Many German soldiers and officers had attempted to surrender to American or British forces rather than face capture by the advancing Soviet army, which was known to treat German prisoners with extreme brutality. It appeared that Müller had somehow managed to assume the identity of a dead American soldier, possibly the real Harold Murphy, who may have been killed during combat, and had successfully integrated himself into American society after the war. This was not unprecedented. There were documented cases of German soldiers who had escaped justice by adopting false identities and emigrating to countries like the United States, Argentina, or Canada. But Sarah's investigation revealed something even more sinister about Heinrich Müller's wartime activities. According to the intelligence records she was able to access, Müller's unit had been involved in war crimes, including the execution of captured Allied soldiers and civilians suspected of supporting resistance movements. Müller himself had been identified as a person of interest in several atrocities committed behind German lines during the occupation of France and Belgium. This meant that the elderly man under Sarah's care was not just a German veteran hiding his true identity, he was potentially a war criminal who had evaded justice for nearly 80 years. Sarah faced an ethical and legal dilemma unlike anything she had encountered in her nursing career. She was caring for a man who might be responsible for the deaths of American soldiers and innocent civilians during World War II. At the same time, Heinrich Müller was now a 98-year-old man in declining health who posed no immediate physical threat to anyone. The question was, what should she do with this information? Sarah spent several sleepless nights weighing her options. She could report her findings to federal authorities, who might launch an investigation into Heinrich Müller's identity and wartime activities. This could potentially lead to his prosecution for war crimes, though given his advanced age and health condition, any legal proceedings would likely be symbolic rather than punitive. Alternatively, she could confront Heinrich directly and try to understand more about his story before involving outside authorities. There might be mitigating circumstances or additional information that would change her understanding of the situation. Sarah also had to consider the impact on the other patients and staff at the Veterans Hospital. The discovery that they had been caring for a German war criminal would be shocking and potentially traumatic for many people, especially the other World War II veterans who were patients at the facility. After much deliberation, Sarah decided to confront Heinrich directly. She felt she owed it to him and to herself to understand the full truth before taking any irreversible actions. She also hoped that after nearly 8 decades of living with his secret, Heinrich might be ready to tell his story honestly. Sarah chose to approach Heinrich during one of his late-night watching sessions. She entered his room quietly and sat down in the chair beside his bed. Heinrich was in his usual position, staring out the window with intense concentration. "Heinrich," she said softly, using his real name for the first time. The old man's reaction was immediate and telling. He turned to her with a mixture of surprise, fear, and what might have been relief. His carefully maintained facade crumbled, and for the first time since she had known him, Sarah saw the real person behind the Harold Murphy identity. "You know," he said simply, his accent now clearly German. "I know," Sarah confirmed. "I know you're Heinrich Müller, and I know you served in the German Wehrmacht during the war." Heinrich closed his eyes and took a deep, shuddering breath. When he opened them again, there were tears on his cheeks. "I have been waiting for this day for 79 years, he said. "Every night I watched for them to come for me. I always knew that someday someone would discover the truth." Over the next several hours, Heinrich told Sarah his story. It was a tale of survival, guilt, and the terrible choices that war forces upon individuals. Heinrich confirmed that he had been a German intelligence officer during World War II, but he claimed that his role had been primarily defensive, gathering information about Allied troop movements and supply lines rather than participating in offensive operations against civilians. According to Heinrich's account, he had been captured by advancing American forces in March 1945 during the final weeks of the war in Europe. While being transported to a prisoner of war camp, the convoy had been attacked by German forces attempting a desperate counteroffensive. In the chaos of the battle, both Heinrich and several American soldiers had been killed or wounded. Heinrich claimed that he had tried to help a wounded American soldier named Harold Murphy, who was approximately the same age and build as Heinrich. Murphy had been dying from his wounds, and in his final moments, he had begged Heinrich to contact his family in Boston and tell them what had happened to him. Heinrich said he had been moved by Murphy's dying words and had attempted to surrender to the approaching American forces while carrying Murphy's identification tags and personal belongings. However, the Americans had assumed that Heinrich was Harold Murphy, and in his wounded and confused state, Heinrich had not immediately corrected their mistake. By the time Heinrich had recovered sufficiently to explain the truth, he had been processed as Harold Murphy and was being prepared for repatriation to the United States. Heinrich claimed that he had tried to explain the confusion to American officials, but his heavily accented English and the chaotic conditions at the end of the war had made it difficult to convince anyone of his real identity. Faced with the choice between revealing his true identity and risking execution as a German officer, or maintaining the Harold Murphy persona and starting a new life in America, Heinrich had chosen survival. He had used Harold Murphy's identity documents to enter the United States as a returning veteran, and he had spent the subsequent decades trying to honor the real Harold Murphy's memory by living a quiet, law-abiding life.
Heinrich insisted that he had never committed war crimes and had not been involved in the atrocities that Sarah had discovered in her research. He claimed that his intelligence unit had focused on military targets and had followed the Geneva Convention guidelines for the treatment of prisoners of war. However, Heinrich acknowledged that other members of his unit had been involved in activities that would now be considered war crimes, and he admitted that he had knowledge of atrocities committed by German forces that he had never reported to authorities. Sarah listened to Heinrich's story with a mixture of fascination and skepticism. While some elements of his account seemed plausible, she found it difficult to believe that a German intelligence officer could have maintained such elaborate deception for nearly 8 decades without being discovered. She also questioned whether Heinrich was telling the complete truth about his wartime activity. "Why are you telling me this now?" Sarah asked. Heinrich looked out the window again, his expression weary. "Because I am dying," he said simply, "and because I can no longer carry this burden alone. For 79 years, I have lived in fear that someone would discover my secret. Every knock on the door, every official letter, every news story about Nazi war criminals being discovered. I thought it was the end." He turned back to Sarah with a look of desperate honesty. "I never meant to deceive anyone for so long. At first, I thought I would stay in America for a few years, then find a way to contact Harold Murphy's family and tell them the truth about what happened to their son. But as time passed, it became more and more difficult to explain why I had waited so long." "What about Harold Murphy's family?" Sarah asked. "They never knew what really happened to their son." Heinrich's face crumpled with grief. "I tried to contact them many times over the years, but what could I tell them? That their son had died trying to save a German soldier? That his identity had been stolen by the enemy he was fighting against? I was a coward. I chose my own safety over their right to know the truth." Heinrich reached under his mattress and pulled out the small notebook that Sarah had seen him writing in. He handed it to her with trembling hand. "This contains everything," he said. "The real story of what happened to Harold Murphy, the location where he died, the names of the other soldiers who were there, everything I remember about that day, and about my life since then." Sarah opened the notebook and saw pages of careful handwriting in both English and German. It appeared to be a detailed confession and memoir, documenting Heinrich's real identity, his wartime service, the circumstances of Harold Murphy's death, and his subsequent life in America under the stolen identity. "I have been writing this for years," Heinrich explained. "At first, I thought I would send it to Harold's family when I was ready to die, but I never found the courage. Now, perhaps you can decide what should be done with this information." Sarah closed the notebook and looked at the elderly man who had carried this secret for nearly 8 decades. Despite the shocking nature of his deception, she felt a complex mixture of emotions: anger at his lies, sympathy for his obvious guilt and suffering, and uncertainty about what justice would look like in this situation. "Heinrich," she said carefully, "I need to report this to the authorities. You understand that, don't you?" Heinrich nodded slowly. "I know. I have always known this day would come. I am ready to face whatever consequences await me. But I want you to know," Sarah continued, "that I will make sure your story is told completely and fairly. If what you've told me is true, then people need to understand the complexity of what happened during the war and its aftermath." Over the next several days, Sarah worked with Heinrich to document his complete story.
She contacted federal authorities, including the FBI and the Department of Justice's Office of Special Investigations, which handled cases involving suspected war criminals. She also reached out to historians and Holocaust researchers who could help verify the details of Heinrich's account. The investigation that followed was extensive but necessarily limited by the passage of time and the death of most potential witnesses. Researchers were able to confirm that Heinrich Müller had indeed served in a German intelligence unit during World War II, and that the real Harold Murphy had been killed in action during the final weeks of the war. However, they found no evidence that Heinrich had personally committed war crimes, though his unit had been involved in activities that violated international law. The investigators concluded that while Heinrich's deception was serious, his advanced age and apparent lack of direct involvement in atrocities made prosecution unlikely. More significantly, Heinrich's confession led to the resolution of a 79-year-old mystery for Harold Murphy's family. Researchers were able to locate descendants of the real Harold Murphy and provide them with information about their ancestors' death and burial location in Germany. This closure was deeply meaningful for family members who had spent decades wondering what had happened to their relative. Heinrich Müller died peacefully in his sleep 6 weeks after his confession to Sarah. He had spent his final days working with historians to provide as much information as possible about his wartime experiences and the fate of other soldiers who had died during the chaotic final weeks of World War II.
At Heinrich's request, his body was cremated, and his ashes were scattered at the location in Germany where Harold Murphy had died, marking the symbolic end of one of the longest cases of stolen identity in American history. Sarah's discovery had profound implications beyond Heinrich's individual case. It highlighted the complexity of justice and identity in the aftermath of global conflict, and it raised questions about how societies should handle the legacy of war crimes when the perpetrators and victims are long dead. The case also demonstrated the importance of truth-telling, even when that truth is painful or complicated. Heinrich's decision to confess his secret had provided closure for Harold Murphy's family and had contributed to historical understanding of the chaotic conditions that existed at the end of World War II. For Sarah, caring for Heinrich during his final weeks had been one of the most challenging and meaningful experiences of her nursing career. She had learned that even the most carefully guarded secrets cannot remain hidden forever, and that the pursuit of truth and justice can take many different forms. The Veterans Medical Center, where Sarah worked, established a new protocol for verifying the identities and service records of elderly patients, partly in response to Heinrich's case. While such elaborate deceptions were rare, the case had demonstrated the importance of maintaining accurate records and being alert to inconsistencies that might indicate identity fraud. Heinrich Müller's story became the subject of several historical studies and documentaries that explored the broader themes of identity, survival, and justice in the aftermath of World War II. His case was unique not because he had assumed a false identity. Many people had done so in the chaos following the war, but because he had maintained that deception for nearly 8 decades while living openly in American society. The notebook that Heinrich had given to Sarah was donated to the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum, where it serves as a primary source document for researchers studying the complex aftermath of World War II. His detailed account provides insight into the experiences of German soldiers during the final weeks of the war and the difficult choices that individuals faced when their world collapsed around them. Today, Sarah continues to work as a nurse at the Veterans Medical Center, where Heinrich Müller's case has become part of the institutional memory. New staff members are told his story as an example of the importance of paying attention to unusual patient behaviors and the value of thorough investigation when something doesn't seem right. The case serves as a reminder that even in the most routine healthcare settings, nurses and other medical professionals may encounter patients whose lives contain extraordinary secrets. Sarah's decision to investigate Heinrich's suspicious behavior had uncovered a piece of hidden history and had provided resolution for a family that had waited 79 years to learn the truth about their loved one. Heinrich Müller's deception had lasted nearly 8 decades, but in the end, the truth had emerged through the careful observation and dedicated investigation of a nurse who refused to ignore the signs that something was not as it appeared. His story demonstrates that while the past may be buried, it is never truly forgotten,
and that the pursuit of truth and justice can continue long after the events themselves have passed into history.